Nice to meet you. No, I tried inviting him. Terrible at it. I mean, you can go over there if you like.
Nice to see you again.
You too. I think it's the sliding stuff. There's more cameras here than we use up. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry that we're a little after 7 o'clock. You can blame Camilla for that, but she did scramble here. But it's all good. We've got lots of time. Thank you very much for coming on a Sunday. I didn't actually expect to see this many of you students on a Sunday. Beautiful day like that, but thank you very much for coming along. My name's Lloyd Burr and I'm a political reporter at News Hub. At the moment, I've been worked for Today FM until they sacked me, and I have worked for News Hub in Europe and in Parliament before that as well. Just a few ground rules today as well, or some housekeeping should I say. There's 2 exits down here and there's exits at the back. We're streaming this on YouTube as well. I think I counted 5 cameras. 4 cameras. And that's on the Debating Society's YouTube page. Is that correct? Is it correct? Great. Fantastic. There's also this QR code up here. If you guys have got any questions and you don't want to ask them like in the flesh today, you can scan that with your phone and then it takes you to a Google form and you go and ask your questions and I'll get them towards the end of that. Put your phones on silent, please. That'd be ideal. In terms of the ground rules of the debate, I don't like it to be sterile. I like it to be a bit lively. So you guys feel free to have a bit of heckling. You guys feel free to do a bit of heckling as well, within reason. The wittier, the better. I'm sure the candidates are completely used to that as well. And we've got 4 chunks. We've separated out into 4 chunks. We've got a section called the intros, where they'll be given 4 minutes each to introduce themselves, where they're standing, what they stand for and all of that. Then we've got a section on the environment, we've got a section on student accommodation and housing, and then we've got a big chunk for audience questions. So that's when we've got a mic here and I'll run it around and you guys can ask the questions yourselves, or of course I'll ask the ones that come through on the QR code. So let's dive straight into it. We didn't actually have assigned seats, but it's quite interesting where you going. Oh, were you?
I was told.
We were told.
Oh, okay. All right. Apparently there were. I just thought it was quite interesting. It was quite interesting how you guys, the left went to the left and the right went to the right. But obviously that was intentional. Well, let's start on this side. We'll start with Felix. You've got 4-ish minutes. If you start boring me, I'll probably cut you short. But you've got 4 minutes to introduce yourself and what you stand for and your pitch to students.
Awesome, thank you. Can everybody hear me correctly? Yes, okay. First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming out tonight, 7 p.m. on a Sunday evening, to come and listen to us talk about our party and our policies. It's a lot of effort to put in our democracy, and it's really important, so it's so great to see so many people here. But before I get into who I am, I just want to talk a little bit about my background. So my name's Felix. I work at a community law centre down in Manukau, and before that I volunteered at the Citizens Advice Bureau in Auckland City, and also worked at the Auckland University Students Association, where I talked to young people about different issues they were facing, whether that be tenancy issues, employment issues, or just disagreements they were having with the university about getting an extension on their assignment. And what I really enjoyed about that was I really enjoyed solving people's problems. I really enjoyed talking to people about issues they were having and then finding ways to, solve their problem, make sure that they left in a better situation. But I really decided to get involved in politics after I realized that even if I talk to someone on a particular day and solve their problem that they might be having with their landlord or their employer, there are still issues that linger in their lives which are more fundamental, right? Issues to do with the cost of living. If they're spending 50% of their income on their rent, they can't afford gas, they can't afford, to pay their power bills, they're struggling every week to afford the necessities. And so, sort of when I was at university, confronted with these issues, I asked, well, what's the problem here? We've got all these people who can't afford all these essentials. We've got people who are struggling, particularly young people. How do we fix their situation, make their lives better? Now, looking at the other parties, you could, give people an extra $60 a week in tax credits. You could have some sort of income guarantee. You could give people a bit more here and there. But the reality is, economically, that's just moving around the deck chairs, right? Because you're not actually solving the problem. Because even if you're getting a little bit more extra week, if the food still goes up by 12%, if the cost of gas still goes up by 14%, if inflation's at 6.7%, then having a little bit more money just gets eaten away, right? It doesn't solve the fundamental problem. And the fundamental economic problem in our society is productivity. The median wage in Australia is $37 and the median wage here is $27. And closing that gap and making sure that we live in a high wage economy where people can afford the necessities is what we need to focus on this election. Because on the face of it, it might look like a cost of living crisis, but really the crisis we have is a productivity crisis. When National came into government in 2008, the wage gap between Australia and New Zealand in terms of the median age was $10,000. Now, the wage gap for the median wage is $23,000. In the last year, 40,000 people left New Zealand for Australia. And so any party which is serious about solving the cost of living crisis needs to solve that productivity crisis, needs to think about how do we make New Zealand a high wage economy. And I'm very glad at ACT's plan. I think they've got a great plan to improve productivity. And the way you improve productivity in this country is you have to make it easier for people to come together, to work together, to start businesses, to build homes, to innovate, to employ other people. And if you can make all of that easier, then you make a society more productive. And so that's why ACT is focused on making our public sector focus on production and productivity. That's why we want to make it easier for people to build houses. That's why we want to tax people less so we can reward them for working hard. That's why we want to make it easier for people to get into employment agreements and negotiate. That's why we want to get more overseas investment. That's why we want to get more immigrants coming in to bring those those important skills that are important to our businesses and hospitals. And if we can do all that, then hopefully we can be the high wage economy, the productive economy that we're destined to be. And that's why I'm supporting ACT this election. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. That was very productive, 3.5 minutes. So you are solving your own productivity crisis there. One thing that I found interesting about you, Felix, is you're relatively new into the Auckland Central seat. What happened there?
What do you mean what happened there?
Wasn't Scott Burness standing?
I think he had to pull out for personal reasons. I'm not totally clued in. I just go where I needed and make the case for ACT where I needed. And I'm very happy to be here today talking to students.
And have many of you guys watched Youth Wings on Spin-Off? So you'll know Felix quite well. What was that like?
No, I didn't say anything.
Okay. All right, let's jump to this side. Let's go with Nina, Dr. Nina Sue from the Opportunities Party, or TOP. And I'll start the timer. 4 minutes.
Hello. We good? Yeah. Kia ora tātou, ngā maki nui ko Nina Sue toka ingoa. I'm Dr. Nina Sue and I'm here to represent the Opportunities Party. Thank you guys so much for coming and thank you to the Debating Society for this evening. So I'm a paediatric and emergency doctor and I'm representing the Opportunities Party here in Epsom and I'm also the health spokesperson. Being here in this room is just giving me a bit of flashbacks back to first year biomed. Very, very difficult time, but here we are. I graduated in 2017 from this university, and so, when we talk about student issues, this is something that is very near and dear to me. And I want to talk a little bit about why I've stepped into this ring, why I've decided to take a little break from working in paediatrics and emergency. And that's because I've noticed that it's really hard to get people healthy and get people to stay healthy, and that's really going to cost us in the long term. I was seeing so many children who are getting sick with long-term problems, with permanent damage to their heart and lungs, just because of the house that they lived in. And I think that's not acceptable, and that's not a good way of using our taxpayer money to treat disease that is preventable. And when we talk about student issues, I want to talk about some conversations I've been having with young people. So the main thing that is front and centre of a lot of students, and I'm sure for you guys as well, is about cost of living. And when we talk about cost of living, the biggest part of cost of living is housing. And Felix raised some really good points about productivity, right? The reason why we have a productivity crisis in New Zealand is because our economy, quote unquote from Bernard Hickey, our economy is a housing market with bits tacked onto it. We cannot have an economy that's built on selling houses to and from people in New Zealand and calling that an economy, because this is going to be costing us in the long term. And so we do need to have an economy that's productive, and we do need people to be able to afford good quality housing and have money left over for the basics, for healthy food, for entertainment, for small business in New Zealand. And that's why I'm really excited to talk about TOP's tax policy of a $15,000 tax-free threshold, so that actually, when you're studying and when you're working, you actually get to keep a bit more in your bank, because we need to make sure that low and middle income New Zealanders are able to have everything they need to thrive. And we need an economy where young people want to live here, where if you do want to go overseas for an OE, that we're going to see you come back, because you're going to want to live in New Zealand where you have affordable housing, good incomes, and a place where you're not going to be priced out of the housing market. So I'm really excited to talk about climate change and housing this evening, and thank you guys so much for coming. And look up the Opportunities Party, because we're here to bring a fresh voice.
Thank you very much. You were also very productive. Well done. Let's actually, one thing that I found out about you, you're from Warkworth, and you were a political nomad until you found TOP. And there's probably quite a lot of people out there at the moment who are political nomads. They look at all the parties and they can't really fit in. Should they choose TOP? Why should they choose TOP? Is TOP even going to be in?
Yeah, I think TOP will have a really good chance at getting into Parliament this year. Our leader, Raf Mungi, he's based down in Ilam, Christchurch. He is a 2-time city councillor there. He was heavily involved during the post-earthquake Christchurch rebuild. He was heavily involved in the community after the March 15th shooting. So he's very qualified, very experienced, and he's there. He's our man on the ground, and he's got a very, very good chance of taking Ilam. And so that means that once he's got Ilam, every party vote counts, and we've got a very good chance of making it to Parliament. And secondly, when we talk about being a political nomad, I chose the Opportunities Party because, again, I didn't feel like I really fit in with any party until I had a conversation with Raf. And I think a lot of people feel like this right now. A lot of people, when I talk to them and I ask them, do you know who you're going to vote for? And we're 1 month away from the election, and a lot of people say they don't know who they're going to vote for. And the Opportunities Party, what we bring is a fresh voice, because we have policies that aren't left, aren't right, they are just good policies. And that's reflected, and when you look at a lot of party policy at the moment from all across the spectrum, there are other parties who are doing very similar policies to our own. So that's why I think we should have the Opportunities Party, because we're just like a think tank for some really good progressive policy that will help everyone.
Whew, that did go on longer than I thought, but that's my fault for asking a supplementary. Let's now hear from someone who's a chartered accountant and he's a banker. Let's hope he's more exciting than those titles. Simon Watts from the National Party.
Geez, what an introduction, Lloyd. Hey, come on. Hey, well, thanks very much, everyone, for coming along this evening. I'm not sure that I would necessarily be coming along on 7 o'clock on a Sunday evening to a lecture theatre to listen to a room full of politicians, but good on you for doing that. So my name's Simon Watts. I'm the Member of Parliament for North Shore. Anyone from the North Shore here? Great. I'm pleased to see 5 people are from the North Shore. Great to have you here. So I've been a Member of Parliament since 2020, one of only 5 Members of Parliament. My year group included a few reasonable people, including Christopher Luxon, who's our leader of our party, and looking forward to being the next Prime Minister, of course, of New Zealand in 26. sleeps from now, so not long to go. So, hey, look, I'm hearing a little bit of banter already, which is great. Good to see you, Chloe and Camilla, from fellow MPs from Wellington. Look, in terms of my responsibilities, I'm the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Regional Development, Local Government, and I'm also Deputy Finance and Deputy Infrastructure, and I've got a couple of other portfolios as well. So portfolios that are really, really important. Obviously, the North Shore sits on the Haraki Gulf as well, so that is a beautiful backdrop and something that is very passionate and personal to me around how we protect and improve that, and is something that I'm very keen to see. The key issue really for this election is going to be around the economy, the impact of the cost of living and inflation, the fact that prices are going up. And Christopher Luxon and I met with a number of students actually at AUT about 9 months ago. They were students doing nursing, physiotherapy and paramedicine. And the students said to us at that point, and that was 9 months ago, we can't afford to be students in this current environment. And I think that really hit home in regards to the pressure that our students are under in regards to the impacts around the cost of living and the inflation and the other considerations and the challenges in which our student population are having to go through to be able to survive and to make ends meet in regards to as they go through their studies. So we absolutely understand that, and we've got a number of policies in regards to the economy which we believe will allow us to rebuild our economy, lower the cost of living, and importantly, make sure that we can get back on track. The other key issue out there is law and order, security. We heard a number of issues, people trying to walk from this campus down to wherever they are is a significant consideration. People don't do it anymore, right? Law and order is a major issue here in the city, and it's a major issue across the country. Statistics have blown out. You're going to hear from two people after me who are actually in government, who have the power to be able to make changes and make decisions over the last 6 years. So the question is, what has been done? What have they done in regards to making the fixes to the problems that we now face? Because I'm not in government. We're in opposition and have been for the last 6 years. But we have got two people in the room that are in government and have been on their watch while this economy and the issues around law and order and the health system and the education system have all gone downhill. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of that commentary as well. In regards to the health system, I'm actually a registered paramedic. I studied paramedicine. I've got 2 undergraduate degrees, one in accounting and finance at Waikato and one at AUT in paramedicine as well. Still jump on a truck every 2 months, do a shift, so I understand the reality and the challenges of a life that many people don't normally see, right? But it's something that I'm hugely passionate about and something that I enjoy. So really looking forward to this evening, looking forward to your questions later on. We'll obviously be asking for your party vote. The party vote is the only vote that counts, so party vote national to get our country back on track. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Simon. Do you often, do you still do your volunteer ambulance driving stuff?
I'm on next Sunday.
Really? Who's that? Was that for St John? Interesting. All right, Chloe, I'm looking forward to you giving Simon a civics lesson. We'll come to you in just a tick, though. Let's hear from Camilla from the Labour Party.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. It's great to see so many of you here, especially as everyone said on a Sunday night at 7 p.m. It's actually my children's bedtime at 7 p.m, so that's why I was a bit rushed here. But great to see all of you here. And I just wanted to ask to start with, how many of you are a member of the Debating Society? Are there most people here debaters? Some debaters? Right, I was involved in debating when I was at secondary school. I was in the Wellington debating team. I grew up in Wellington, and I really loved it. I thought it was really fun. I got to debate against interesting people, think about interesting ideas, and I found that it was a good way of practicing public speaking and that kind of thing. And then I kind of got to university, and I did join the university debating club, but I talked to my grandfather. And he said, why don't you actually start arguing about something you believe in? And so I kept up with debating for a while, but I thought in addition to doing debating, maybe I should start to do some work in things that I actually do believe in. And so after that, I did start working, advocating for younger people, advocating for students. I was involved, if there's anyone here from AUSA, was involved in students' associations. I looked a lot at the issues that have been raised by some of the previous speakers around cost of living, difficulty for students. Was really pleased when Labor brought in interest-free student loans. That was a big moment for us because at that time we'd had high interest rates. I mean, we talk about high interest rates now. That was 7% back then that students were paying on their loans. Was really, really significant, and it was it was creating problems of inequity. So that was one of the issues that I worked on. Since then, I was a women's officer when I was a student, and then I also became an employment lawyer, and I advocated and did advocacy for mainly unions and people working for people who are members of unions. So I really took that advice from my grandfather seriously. And so all of you in the debating society, if you want to get involved in some political activities and start advocating for some of that other stuff, you'll find that your skills are readily transferable, and you might get some amazing results in terms of creating some positive change as well. So that's my background, really. I've been in Parliament for 3 years, the same amount of time as Simon, and also Christopher Luxon, who wants to be Prime Minister. So just leave that with you. And one of the other things I just wanted to mention is that we realise that it's been a really difficult time for people for many reasons. We know that the COVID pandemic was incredibly difficult. Some of the experiences we had, I don't think any of us thought that we would have during our lifetime, and I just want to acknowledge the ongoing impact that that's had on people. Those of you who were students at that time would have had that impacted on your studies as well. It's a huge thing to live through. And then at the beginning of this year, of course, we had the floods and Cyclone Gabriel, which were also incredibly difficult, especially for Auckland with the floods. I know there were impacts of those for those people whose properties were impacted, but also I think it was really difficult psychologically to just deal with the fact that something that we'd always felt was relatively harmless, the rain, which we have a lot of in Auckland, was causing severe damage and actually loss of life. So these are huge challenges that we have to tackle. The cost of living pressures, I also acknowledge, have been really tough. We are seeing some hope on the horizon, though, with inflation coming down. Of course, we're not having a projected recession, which is good news. And we've also had really good employment figures, so really high levels of employment throughout the community, which is obviously creating a buffer for some of those tougher impacts of the financial times that have been global. So I think we sometimes do hear from people that they want change, and it's natural to want change when times are tough. But I would just encourage you to reflect on the type of change that you want. Chris Hipkins has trusted leadership, and he's in it for you and all New Zealanders. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Camilla. No supplementary for you because you used up all of your time. Let's hear from the MP for this area, Chloe from the Greens.
Kia ora te whānau, everyone can hear me? Yeah, cool, sweet. Stuff's kind of cooked at the moment, right? Like, I guess to lay it out on there on the table, like, I don't know anybody right now in my personal or professional life who is not just utterly exhausted or overwhelmed or feeling anxious or depressed or a sense of inertia or apathy with the state of things as they currently are. And I guess the message that I wanted to give to all of you in my introduction, throwing all of my notes to the wind, is that this is not inevitable. All of us as individuals can feel as though all of this stuff is just so utterly overwhelming. But when you talk to your neighbours or your co-workers or fellow university students and you come to understand that the pressures that you are under are the same pressures that others are under, you can start to kind of look up the food chain and see how all of us are ultimately connected, and far too many people are currently suffering under the status quo, under the system that we presently have in place. And that system that we presently have in place, that set of rules and regulations which are producing these outcomes, are inherently political. Because politics is not just like Shakespearean soliloquies that occur in the parliamentary chamber where people shout at each other and it's all nonsense and so far removed from people's day-to-day lives. Politics is about power, and it's about resources, and it's about the decisions that saturate our daily lives. So if we want to talk about how the economy, this notion that Simon was throwing around before, is inherently political, it's reflective of values, the kinds of things that we want to prioritise. Because the economy is not this thing that we have to serve. It's not a deity. It wasn't served to us on concrete slabs from the gods. It is in fact a human-made creation that reflects the kinds of things that we want outcomes on. So I inherently, as a Green, believe, which something that Jeanette Fitzsimons, our founding co-leader, once said, we currently have an economic system that exploits both people and the planet, but that can change. And you only have to look at the economic history of this country to get a sense of how that can change and has changed in the past. So in the 30s and 40s, in the wake of the World Wars and the Great Depression, there was a decision made to tax those who had benefited handsomely during a time of hardship for many to pay for the introduction of the welfare state. It gave us weekends. It gave us the ostensible 40-hour work week, which we've seen eroded. It gave us our public healthcare system, public housing and public education. But then in the 80s and 90s, there were concerted political decisions, the forebear of the ACT Party, which gave us the trickle-down economics that we live in the consequences of to this day. And we saw the shredding of that social contract. And 30 to 40 years on from that, in the 2020s, confronted with the dual crises of the largest rates of wealth inequality that we have literally ever seen on record in this country, and the climate crisis, particularly profoundly and tangibly known to Aucklanders when it landed on our doorstep at the start of this year, we can change that economy once again to grapple with the challenges of our time. And that's the proposal from the Greens. You know, everybody's given you their slogan and their introductory remarks, but our one is we've been banging on about this stuff for the last 30 years. And unfortunately, when it comes to climate change, there is no awesome feeling when you're right. The time is now for the solutions that we have been fighting for 30 plus years. There is a reason that we see ourselves as the parliamentary wing of an activist movement, because that is where we get our power, from our community. And that is why I am so proud and I'm asking for the opportunity to keep on doing the mahi for the next 3 years. Because we have spent a huge amount of effort building, you often hear in climate change around negative feedback loops, building a positive feedback loop where we show people on the ground the kinds of stuff that we want to see is totally possible. And we scale that up, and then we get to that point of systemic change by reminding every single one of you of your individual power to contribute to collective action. Looking forward to getting into it. Thanks, Lloyd.
Thank you very much. Question for you, Chloe, because there's still 30 seconds here. Are you in government?
I have personally never been in government. So in the 2017 to 2020 term, we had a confidence and supply arrangement, which meant that we were given confidence to the budget, but that we negotiated every single piece of legislation. And I obviously sat outside as a non-executive member to that. And in this term, we have a cooperation agreement, which again, because Labour have an outright majority, means that our vote is not necessary to pass any piece of legislation. We don't have the same visibility over the likes of cabinet papers as we did in the former arrangement with confidence and supply. And we regularly vote against their laws.
Just before we go into the first round, party slogans. What's the ACT Party one?
Real change.
What's Nationals?
Country back on track.
Top.
A fresh voice.
Well, you've just said yours quite a lot.
Time is now.
And Camilla, you finished on yours, I think, didn't you? Wonderful. I don't actually know what most of those mean. Slogans, they're funny things, aren't they, slogans? All right, let's, remember, if you've got any questions that pop up, you can either just put up your hand and we'll kind of go a bit off-piste, or you can do the scanny thing with the QR code and fire it through that way. Let's start with the environment, because in Auckland alone, the cost of the flooding and cyclones that we had at the beginning of this year, it's going to hit around $4 billion, probably going to go more than that. I want to know how each of your parties plan to address the climate crisis, or whether you think there is a climate crisis, because I know the ACT Party probably doesn't think there is, and how do we reduce New Zealand's carbon emissions? We started that side first. Let's start reverse order, actually. You can start, Chloe. Yeah, let's do reverse order. Why not? Let's mix it up.
How long do I have? It's like quite a big existential question, Lloyd.
Yeah, you do like to talk, so let's put a 3-minute cap on it.
A 3-minute cap? All
Yeah,
right,
3 minutes. Let's go
Okay.
3 minutes.
So we're talking about the climate crisis. We have to both mitigate, which means to drag down climate changing emissions, to bend the curve, as James often puts it, but we also have to adapt to the climate change, which we have already baked in. So to give you some context, we know that if we were to burn all of the oil and gas and coal reserves that we have already identified as a planet, then we would burst past 2 degrees of warming. What we've agreed to internationally as 190 plus countries through the ICCC and the United Nations framework is to not burst past 1.5 degrees of warming, because that is what is necessary to keep the climate and therefore the economy, because jobs happen on a planet, somewhat stable into the future. If we burst past 2 degrees, then we are looking at not only massive floods, droughts, and other impacts on humanity, but all of the species that we drag down with us. So it's, I often get critiqued, especially by Felix and the ACT Party, for trying to paint this as chaos, but the reality is that's just the science, unfortunately. We kind of have to do something about it. So in order to play our part, what we've said is that we have to look at our emissions profile. The Greens in the last 6 years with a Minister of Climate Change, James is in government, what he has done is implemented the framework called the Zero Carbon Act, which says that this is the framework for how we're going to get to net neutrality by 2050 through this process of what are called carbon budgets, which are allocated or information is given through the Independent Climate Change Commission established by that Zero Carbon Act to the government to figure out how to do something called emissions reductions plans. So those are in kind of several yearly groupings. And basically what those emission reduction plans look at is every single sector and every single industry in our country to say how are we going to do that? How are we going to, for example, reduce our transport emissions, our agricultural emissions and other ways? Now you're going to hear probably quite a lot about something called the ETS or the Emissions Trading Scheme. Currently, every single industry in this country is priced except for our largest polluting industry, and that is, of course, as you all probably know, agriculture, which is responsible for 50% of our climate changing emissions. So if you want, even from a market-based economics way of looking at the world, to have a functional market, we need to include that industry. We have to include all industries. Now, the Climate Change Commission will tell you that the ETS is not a social tool. That is simply the way that we can go about using those market economics to reduce climate changing emissions, but we have to use social policy to mitigate the impacts on lower income people in particular. So that's largely how we go about fixing the ETS. We have to include agriculture in it. We also have to look at transport in our largest cities, and the Greens put forward a number of plans to do that. I'm really aware of my time here. We also have to look at adaptation. The Greens put forward our climate resilience plan, which looks at a $750 million fund that would be available for local governments to mitigate, not only looking at our pipes and waterways and other ways, but also green infrastructure, how we can daylight our streams, how we can use our wetlands far more effectively to stymie the flow of water in such a way that we don't end up seeing that built infrastructure being overwhelmed. Bang on.
That was. Nailed it. Thank you very much, Chloe. Let's come to Simon now. Just before we do that, how many of you guys are undecided in terms of, do you know who you're going to vote for? If you don't know who you're voting for, put your hand up. Okay. Quite a lot. Is there anyone here who's not enrolled to vote? Okay, Karpai. Good. I don't think I saw any hand. Oh. Okay. I mean, are you over 18? Okay, that makes sense. Sorry, I'm 35, my eyes are failing. Simon, would you like to address this now? What is the National Party's plan to address the climate crisis, if you want to call it a climate crisis, and how do we reduce the country's emissions?
I love a loaded question from the MC. Absolutely. National are absolutely 100% committed in regards to meeting and committed to meeting our 2030 targets for climate change and 2050, and that is in regards to both methane but also carbon. So our net zero commitments for 2050 are critical, but also 2030. 2030 is 75 months away from today. 75 months. And that is the reality of how fast we need to accelerate the pace of change in order to reduce and lower emissions. There is no clarity from this current government of what are the exact actions and steps that they will take in the next 75 months to hit 2030. And exactly in providing that clarity and substantiation around that. And that is the degree of detail that we need to be able to see, to be able to give confidence that we can actually achieve these goals, because it is critical that we achieve these goals. National has outlined a number of key policies in regards to making this happen. The key element around allowing us to transition off fossil fuels and move off fossil fuel vehicles onto electric is around increasing the amount of electricity and renewable energy that we have in this country. We've committed to doubling the amount of of renewable energy by 2050. That is critical. You've got to talk all you like about transitioning to EVs, but if they're powered by Indonesian coal, then that doesn't help our climate. We need more renewable energy, and that's a key policy that we've committed to. In regards to agriculture, 50% of our emissions regarding agriculture, we've got to reduce that by 10% by 2030 and between 24 and 47% by 2050. The only way in which we will reduce livestock emissions is through research and development and biotechnology around additives and other supplements that will reduce the methane that is emitted from livestock. The other option, which currently is proposed primarily by the Greens, is cull the herd, right? Well, that is economic suicide for this country in regards to a solution. We must focus on biotechnology, solutions that are there, that are commercially available, that we can then lead the globe. Because there is a large number of countries around the world that have agriculture that need these solutions, and New Zealand should lead on that. We've also talked about putting EV charging network across the country to ensure that you can charge your EVs, and we'll have a clear roadmap in order to achieve our goals required for both 2030 and 2050. If we're in government, I'm going to be the Shadow Minister for Climate Change, and I take that role hugely seriously, and I'll do everything in my power to ensure that we meet those objectives.
Well, just a quick question. When you're in government, will you still be the Shadow Minister? Or will you be the Minister?
Well, that's a decision for the leader, of course, but I am the spokesperson for climate change.
Okay, wonderful. Chloe, there was a few barbs there and a few things that you've taken issue with. Does the Green Party want to kill off the herd? Do you want to kill off the cows and the sheep?
The head of Federated Farmers is on the record of saying that we perhaps have already reached peak cow. All right. We have currently a set of economic circumstances in our agricultural sector that actually at present incentivises particularly dairy farmers to load more cows onto their farm beyond the point of productivity per cow. We can extract more productivity if we were to reduce those herd sizes. There are ways of doing this, and again, if you were to look at just Google emissions reduction plan, by the way, to completely debunk the introductory remarks from Simon. The second of the Google responses will take you to the Ministry for the Environment's page, where you will see the breakdown of the emissions reduction plan by sector for the next 15 years. So I also just need to make that point. Go hard.
So why, after 6 years as your Minister for Climate Change, still disagreeing with the Labour Minister around, after 4 attempts on agricultural emissions, you still haven't got a viable plan on the table?
Because we are the Green Party and not the Labour Party. If we were in charge of the government, we would have done things that we have said that we want to do, but we have an outright Labour majority in this term of Parliament, which has meant that we have not been able to progress things as much as we want to. So, the other thing which Simon spoke to is renewable energy into EVs, and I think it's important to unpack a few of these. So you would have seen potentially in the climate resilient policy from the Greens that we've also proposed...
I'm giving you 1 minute, Chloe. 1 minute. You've already had 3.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to renewable energy in particular, the key proposal that we're making is not solely about reducing or generating more renewable energy, because actually what you see if you look into the Independent Climate Change Commission's advice is that you are actually getting diminishing returns from the amount of resources that you put into that, and there's far better places for us to potentially be investing in order to reduce climate changing emissions. So that for us is all actually about resilience and people being able to reduce their power bills. The other thing, EVs. EVs were not invented to save the planet. EVs were invented to save the car industry. And if you load more cars onto our roads, you are continuing with the issues of congestion. So if you want to talk about a developed society, about developed cities around the world, I would bring you the liveliness, guys. Come on. Apathy wins elections. So ultimately, if you want to look at societies where they have developed in such a way that they are far more equitable, they are not the societies where everybody, including the poor, can afford a car. It is where everybody, including the rich, takes public transport, because it is efficient, it is cost effective, and it's clean. And that's where we need to be heading. Get us back on track, Simon.
I like this. Keep it lively. You can interrupt. This is good. This is like a little mini parliament. So keep the barbs flying across the floor. It is interesting that you kind of criticise EVs when it's your minister who introduced the clean car.
Yeah, and I can speak to that.
No, I don't want you to speak to that. Not at all. Let's go to Camilla now, and I want you to address two things. One, you've got the Green Party around the government table, well, they're not around the cabinet table, but they've got two ministers in your government. One of them is the climate change minister, yet they haven't been able to roll out what they want to do. They've kind of been given the role, but you haven't allowed them to, roll out the agricultural emissions plan that they've had to change and all of that type of stuff. They've got no leverage. I know they're only ever going to go with Labour, they're never going to go with the Nats, but you're not treating them with respect, are you? So I want you to answer that. Because otherwise Chloe will probably ask you that. And also, how is the Labour Party or a Labour government going to address the climate change crisis? Your former leader said it was the nuclear-free moment. Yeah, of our generation.
Well, I agree with that. And one of the first things that I did when I was elected into Parliament was vote to declare a climate emergency. And I think that type of thing is really important because we have to acknowledge the problem in order to make sure that we take the actions in order to mitigate it. And so a lot of what Chloe said I agree with in terms of the action that we've taken. We really value James Shaw as Minister for Climate Change, and I disagree with the allegation that we don't respect him and value his contribution, because I think he's done a really good job, and you can see that with the emissions coming down for the last 3 years, which is really good. It's not enough, I know, but it's really good to see that's happening. And I suppose with the Green ministers as well, obviously we did this term have a Labour majority. It wasn't necessary for us to have Green ministers, but I think it shows the deep relationship between the two parties and the fact that we can work constructively together, that we see, even when it's not necessary, the leadership and insight that people like James Shaw and Marama Davidson can bring and contribute as part of ministers in the government. So I think it kind of shows the opposite, really, that we do really value them. So thanks for bringing that up. But nice to have the opportunity to say nice things about James and Marama. Also on agricultural emissions, I mean, this has been a really hard subject matter for New Zealand. And so the way that we've approached it is to work really closely with farmers, with the agricultural sector, to try and nut out an agreement that's actually going to work and be constructive long term. We don't want to bring in a scheme that gets chucked out as soon as the government changes, because that's not going to help anyone. We actually need a scheme that is accepted, and I think there is will there. I don't think it's correct to say that farmers are on the whole opposed to being part of an emissions scheme. I think there's a lot of farmers who are actually really interested in making sure that they do contribute in the way that they should, and they recognise obviously the scale of the emissions as well. So it's really about continuing with that work, and we have committed to continuing with that work and not excluding farmers from the ETS. So, I mean, there's a lot we can talk about in relation to climate. I think that in Auckland I've noticed a real change since the January floods and Cyclone Gabrielle. I'm not having any arguments with people about whether climate change exists or when it might arrive. Where I think we can all accept that it's here and it's now, and we have to reduce our emissions, but also adapt as well. And that's one of the next pieces of work that Labour is committed to implementing, is the adaptation plan, because we know that that's a really fundamentally important part of addressing our climate crisis, is having that adaptation around climate change as well as the emissions reduction at the same time. And just a few rebuttal points, because we are the debaters today, for Simon. A lot of passion about EVs, but wanting to cut the clean car discount seems a little bit contradictory to me. All of us living in Auckland can see over the last few years the change in our fleet of cars. We see so many EVs out there now, and I don't know if we're a slightly self-defeating argument over there, but we see so many EVs now, and we're seeing a real change in what people want to invest in. I think people do want to invest in those types of vehicles that do have lower emissions as well. It's been super successful. It's changed the fundamental nature of our car fleet. So I think that we should continue with it. We've committed to continuing with it. We've also committed to renewable energy. I know that's been brought up by a couple of speakers as well. we think we can reach 100% renewable energy. You might have seen some coverage about what's happening in other countries, because other countries have also had cost of living crises. And in the UK, one of the major drivers of that was electricity bills. I don't actually, how long have you been back, Lloyd? Did you have a big power bill over in the UK?
Oh, I can't actually. 2 and a bit years I've been back.
Yeah, okay, could probably miss
Yeah, 2 and a bit years.
But anyway, when you don't have renewable electricity, that's obviously been a significant issue because of the price of fuel. So we think we can make our electricity 100% renewable, and that will be good for the environment and also hopefully good for people's pockets as well. Are you timing this?
Yeah, I forgot to do it, so I'm guessing you've got about 10 seconds left.
Anyway, there's lots of other important things to cover. It's obviously a hugely important subject matter, and I think the next government, if it's a Labour-led government with the Greens, will be able to make some real progress to protecting New Zealand from the effects of climate change.
Thank you very much. We'll come to you, Dr. Sue, in just a tick. We just want to go to Felix from the ACT.
Sure. The ACT.
Jeepers, I don't know what I've done, but I've got something going on here.
I might sit for this one. Look, every party's got to have a climate change policy. Climate change is extremely important. We've seen the floods, we've seen the natural disasters occur across the world, and it's clear that, we need to take action. And so ACT Party has a policy for adaptation, and then we also have a practical policy for mitigation. When it comes to adaptation, we need to make sure that our infrastructure is ready for climate change. And the main body that is going to be receiving the brunt of the climate change impacts are councils, right? Because the things that are going to be put under strain when climate change is happening, when we have floods, are the pipes, it's the stormwater drains, it's the electricity, it's the infrastructure under our homes. And in order to prepare councils to help pay for that adaptation infrastructure, we need to make sure that councils have the money. And so that's why ACT Party has a GST sharing plan to make sure that councils actually have an alternative stream of revenue to make sure that they can actually afford to pay for adaptation in our communities. But then it comes to mitigation. And the ACT Party says that when it comes to mitigation, we need to have a practical approach when it comes to climate change. Because the reality is if we decide to price our CO2 emissions very high, if we include agriculture into the ETS, we're only going to make our country extremely poor, right? Because everything's going to cost more, our exports are going to suffer, everything is going to be unaffordable in terms of the electricity, because all of that still produces CO2. But we also can't do nothing, because if we do nothing, then we become an international pariah where no one wants to trade with us because we're not doing enough for climate change. So good mitigation policy is about recognizing both of those realities and saying that we need a policy that goes down the middle, a policy that ties the carbon price we pay to our top 5 trading partners. So we do enough to make sure that we're doing our part on the global stage, but we don't do so much that we become economical. The problem with doing so much or adding agriculture to the ETS is that it actually doesn't make a difference to emissions globally, right? Because the problem is that if we don't satisfy the demand for global protein or beef production, someone else will. So if we put agriculture into the ETS and we say to our farmers, you're going to have to pay this much, and then they lose on the international market, someone else fulfills that demand, and they're probably going to fulfill that demand less sustainably. And so what you get when you add agriculture to the ETS is you get our farmers becoming less competitive and probably other people overseas making beef and doing it less sustainably. That's why every sensible party on the stage, Labour, National and us, don't want to include agriculture into the ETS, because we recognise that if we do include it, we only make our situation worse and don't really affect global emissions. And so that's why when I'm talking to you guys and say who you're voting for, I say vote for a practical party like ACT that's got a practical approach to climate change mitigation. Thank you. I got to write I'm an outline.
No, it is. Okay.
What's the line?
You want to talk about how the ETS...
I'll give you 30.
No, okay, so look,
He's got 30 seconds left. You can use 27. Go.
If you want to talk about baseline market economics and excluding the industry that is solely responsible for the majority of our climate changing emissions, then what you're talking about is absolute cookery. Because what we have baked into the way that the ETS currently works is something which takes into account something called carbon leaching, which is what Felix has been alluding to, when you have production of something moving offshore and becoming less sustainable in terms of climate changing emissions than what we could do onshore. That's baked into something called free allocation to those industries that currently can't deliver, and that is something which the ETS can cater for, is my point. The supposed party of market economics doesn't want market economics when it comes to climate changing emissions, and that's ridiculous.
it doesn't. Can I respond, Lloyd?
Yep,
Can I respond?
give it, yep.
It doesn't change the simple fact that if we put agriculture into the ETS, it makes our farmers more unproductive. And our farmers have to compete globally, right? Because when someone is in a supermarket in the UK, in Europe, in America, and they look at the shelf and they look at what steak they're going to buy, they look at the price of the good and they say, which one's cheaper? Which one's more expensive? And if Chloe is narrowing the profit margin on that good by adding agriculture to the ETS, it only makes us more unprofitable on the global stage. The reason why Chloe wants to add agriculture to the ETS and the reason why it would reduce emissions is that it makes the farms so unproductive that we have less farming in our country. So that's going to make us less competitive overseas. It means we're going to have less exports. We're going to suffer more as an economy. Okay, otherwise, what would be the point in putting agriculture into the ETS if it isn't going to reduce the competitiveness of agriculture and reduce CO2 emissions? What's the point? Because that's how it works, right?
No. But there's a okay. So productivity is not the same thing as the price that something costs. And again, if you're talking about the ETS, you're talking about market signals about what we should.
It is the same. It is the same. It is the same because if we're more competitive and if we can sell more of our good overseas, then we are more productive. So they are linked. I don't get your point.
No, you can have high commodity and high quantity, but not high quality, and those things are all again different component parts that you can extricate out when you're talking about productivity.
No, this is just fantasy. The fundamental reality is that.
Okay, I'm going to call time on this because this is getting a bit old. Thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll get to this. This is probably going to happen time and time again. But thank you very much for both of that. One thing I will say, Felix, is that when I was in the UK, they don't just think about price anymore. They think about the carbon footprint of the leg of lamb, the leg of New Zealand lamb that's there, and whether it's come from a sustainable country. They don't just think about the price.
ETS is fundamentally a price mechanism. That's the way it sends its signal. So that's what we have to debate at the end of the day.
Thank you very much for that.
Awesome.
Let's come to Dr. Sue from the Opportunities Party. What's your party's position on climate change?
Kia ora. So I'm going to do the good job of a centrist party and actually criticise both sides. So I'm going to go back to the Labour-Greens relationship, which I think we should go back to that as well. So we talked about before, Camilla, that you said that you guys really respect the relationship you have with the Greens. But I think from this year, we've seen actually Labour has really disrespected Greens actually more than once. So I think most recently in their $4 billion of funding cuts to whatever, to save money for whatever, $236 million was taken out of the Climate Response Fund. So I think that goes to show, that's not necessarily the number one priority for Labour Party at this stage. And then when we go to both the major parties, we're seeing National wants to build roads, $25 billion on roads. Labour wants to spend $45 billion on a second harbour crossing. That's not what a real climate change policy looks like.
What an EV drive on.
What was that, sorry?
What is an EV drive on?
There's actually...
Stop putting potholes in them if we remove traffic.
What's a hydrogen bus drive on?
And back to the EV problem, we're not going to we're not going to EV our way out of this climate emission problem. We need to be looking at the start to finish lifetime of a lithium battery. And where do you think we get the lithium batteries from? We mine that lithium from indigenous land, indigenous mountains offshore. So what we do need investment into public transport, and we can electrify, our buses and things like that, because we know that public transport is how we reduce our emissions. And investing in trains, investing in electric buses. I want to bring it back to the emissions trading scheme as well. It is a tool, but I think it's very flawed at the moment, because what we've seen with the with the uncapped use of pine forestry as carbon sequestration, we've actually seen the cheapening of our carbon tax credits. So what that means is that we're not actually giving these industries the incentive to decarbonise, to reduce their emissions. We're seeing cheapening of our carbon taxes, carbon tax credits. And so what we actually need to do is put a cap on that. And, when we talk about farmers, farmers, they are the original people who are in the environment. They are on the land day in, day out. They see the effects of climate change, and they can be partners in this move to sustainability and climate change. And we can't keep blaming them for, our emissions crisis at the moment, okay? So, we can bring them into the emissions trading scheme, but talk about things like a biodiversity credit, where if, we end up, introducing emissions taxes on farmers, we can introduce a biodiversity credit as well to say that actually don't just plant pine trees that are going to acidify the land, that's going to cause land erosion. Let's encourage them to plant biodiversity, to plant natives, plant riparian planting as well, to clean up our waterways. That's how we move to the future, where we have a climate-focused policy that brings everyone together on board. And that's what we want to see with the Opportunities Party, is evidence-based climate policy, working together.
You've still got 14 seconds, so I'm going to throw a supplementary your way. Do you want rail to the shore?
I'd have to have a look at the business case, but ideally that would be nice.
Because how will the trains... How will the trains...
The initial harbour crossing, and it's good.
So you're criticising the additional harbour crossing, but how are the trains meant to get there? Because the proposal is for tunnels for cars and for rail. So do you want just the rail tunnels?
Well, they could do the rail first and then the road.
And then what's going to happen when the bridge, starts rusting and cars can't use it? Do you start thinking about cars getting across to the other side of the harbour now?
Again, I'd have to have a look at the business case for the rail and the second harbour crossing, but it seems like $45 billion is quite a lot of money, and that seems like a pretty conservative estimate for how much it would actually cost us.
All right, let's open up to questions from the floor. Does anyone have any questions after the first two rounds? Don't be shy, put your hands up. Okay, we've got quite a few. All right, let's start down the front here. We've got a roving mic. Okay, maybe it's... All right, I'm going to have to borrow one of yours. Is that all right? Thank you.
Yeah, the current plan that was proposed to build a rail crossing under the harbour bridge is for light rail rather than, regular rail. If you've ever been travelling around Melbourne or Barcelona or anywhere that has light rail, you'll know that one of the massive advantages is that it can stop frequently and it's easy to get on and off. Will there be any stops under the harbour that will justify the use of light rail?
I love you.
Let's start with Camilla.
I'm not sure about the genuine nature of that question, but probably I would imagine for maintenance there probably would be the ability to stop under the harbour bridge, under the harbour. Yeah, I mean, I've travelled a lot in Eurostar and things, and there is capacity for that, but I don't think most likely for recreation would probably not be the purpose of it.
Was your question targeted at a specific person? Was it? Yeah, Chloe, would you like to see light rail have a stop under the harbour?
What we need is to change the current approach for Auckland Light Rail, which is currently going below ground, and it's going to cost more, it's going to have more embodied carbon, and it's going to take more time to deliver. And if we were to take it above ground, then we would end up saving money such that we could do above ground light rail and also in Wellington and Christchurch, and we could deliver it faster, more cost effectively, and with less embodied carbon. But I think the point that you're ultimately making is that going below ground with light rail, as opposed to heavy rail, and therefore the kind of capacity or lack of capacity that you would be getting if you were to opt for heavy rail, just doesn't make sense. And that's precisely what I'm hearing from engineers who currently work on the CRL.
Great. Who else had their hand up? I'll come back to you. We've got one up here. Please say who you want the question to be directed at. Can you pass that along? Thank you.
So my question is for the national candidates. So as we know, China is the biggest market for all the dairy products. And I think the dairy industry is shrinking at the moment because China actually doesn't need as much as dairy product as we do before. So I saw on the news when Luxon talked about genetic editing. So that's quite worrying for me because I think lots of concerns and about the risk of genetic editing to the industry and also its biosecurity. And China doesn't take any genetic editing GMO products. So how would you respond to that?
Is that for a particular candidate? Yes. Oh, the Nats. Oh, sorry. Yep.
Yeah, look, so the point around the concerns around biotechnology is absolutely a reasonable concern. The model and the policy that National have put in place is to replicate the Australian model, which is to put in place an independent regulator to oversee the processes around that and ensure that the appropriate controls and monitoring are in place to mitigate risk. And so, your concerns are reasonable, but and the ones that we identified in our policy, and the regulator will mitigate that. In regards to the China conversation around demand, etc. Look, at the end of the day, population growth across the world is growing. New Zealand's core equity is producing agricultural products. We are one of the best countries in the world to do that. And we should really lean in to the opportunity for New Zealand to be able to identify how we can reduce methane emission from our livestock, and then share that with other countries around the globe that also undertake agriculture, so that we across the globe reduce emissions to enable us to meet our climate change objectives.
Are you happy with that answer?
I'm still curious how they're going to mitigate the risk. That's the biggest problem. Yeah.
Regulate it is what he just said. All right. If you're able to pass the microphone back to our wonderful mic runner, that would be awesome. And we'll do some more questions in a tick. Let's move on to our third category, which is housing, and mainly student housing as well, because if I remember my time as a student, it wasn't in Auckland, it was in Dunedin, so probably a little bit cheaper, but still bloody expensive and really crap. And I'm sure there might be some of you who do have black mould and mushrooms growing in your bathroom. But let's talk about the housing and the cost of living, because it's pretty damn high at the moment because of rent. You guys feeling the pinch out there? How much of your income goes towards rent? Is it more than half, more than 3/4?
Like student loans can't even cover our bills. We have to go work.
So it's 100%? Yeah?
We get nothing from National's tax plan.
Okay, well you can address that, Simon, when we get to it. So we've got the squeeze middle and the squeeze students. I'd love to know what your plans are for this. So the question to our candidates, what is your party's policies to reduce housing costs for New Zealanders, but particularly for our audience tonight, for students? Let's start with you, Simon Watson. You can talk about how National's policy is not going to give anything to students, allegedly.
I love the political impartiality from the moderator this evening, isn't it? Isn't it stunning? Look, key issue, as I said before, when Christopher and I met with students nearly 12 months ago in regards to the issue, it's too expensive to be a student, right? And I think the feedback that the students were telling us then was exactly what you've just articulated. That, 70%, I think you said, was a proportion of rent. That's just like, where do you start, right? And so at the end of the day, in regards to that amplifies how important it is for us to rebuild our economy and get our economy back so we've got high incomes to be able to support that amount. But in regards to housing, we need more housing. And we've got a policy around build to rent, and build to rent is an area which isn't highly leveraged in New Zealand, but is overseas. But an opportunity for people to be able to move into long-term rental accommodation, 2 to 7 years, be able to put down roots and be able to form that, get themselves into the workforce, get some money behind them, and be able to progress into home ownership. I think the challenge is it's just out of touch, completely impractical to think about buying a home when you're looking at a situation where 70% is going on rent, and that's just not appropriate. And that has challenges because that then stops people from studying, right? It means that people aren't going to pursue their career or aspiration. And we need you all to be pursuing your aspiration in terms of the area of study that you want to do, because we need that skill set and capability to build a future New Zealand that we all want to be part of. So addressing this is critical. We've got a number of policies around that, and only a change and only a party vote for National will ensure that those policies get implemented in 26 sleeps from now.
That didn't answer the question.
3 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a minute 52 left if you'd like to keep going. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
sorry, what was the question you did?
What was the question that I didn't answer?
Did someone
Answer the question. Was the question?
No, I said you said in terms of how you provide more housing, and I've said we've got policies around build to rent, which is a housing policy to increase the amount of rental accommodation that's available. One of the challenges around the price of rent is the lack of supply, right? So if there's not a lot of supply of rental accommodation, then the price is going to be higher. Yeah. Yeah. But what I'm saying is the price of the accommodation that you've got at the moment is high because there isn't a large supply of those houses. It's a very finite amount. And what we're saying is we need to increase the amount of supply of accommodation out there. That should look to reduce the overall price that you're needing to pay. And that's the policy position.
Will Luxon reduce his rent?
No. Appreciate your vote.
Thank you for that, Simon. I do take issue with you calling me saying I'm not impartial.
Oh, as I stood up.
No, there was a question from the audience that I asked you to address. I mean, what I can say is when you start blaming the referee, you know how the rest of that goes.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I've had worse. I've had worse from Winston Peters. Let's hear from Labor, because I want to know how the heck you're going to explain this. Because over the last 6 years, things have got out of control. You've changed the rules. The bright line test, you've extended to 10 years. Interest deductibility has targeted some of those people who've got lots of homes, but it's also targeted people who have circumstances have changed and they can't deduct it off their income in certain areas. So it's not exactly targeted. And look at the rents. We've had students saying that they can't afford it. So how are you going to explain what you've done and what you're going to do to the housing market for students?
Thank you. First of all, I want to address why housing is so important for students. As I said earlier, it was an issue that I looked at a lot when I was representing students, and one of the reasons that I always talked about at that time is because we don't want education to be a situation that you can only access if you're wealthy or if you come from a wealthy family, and I think it is really important to look at the sustainability of students being able to actually study, and that's because we need people to be educated. I think this is the third debate I've had with Chloe talking about education as a public good, but it's something I agree with as well. So I think it is really important. I think housing is a huge issue this election too, for a number of reasons, and one of them is to do with National Party policy, but I'll talk more about Lloyd's original question. You're doing a great job, by the way, Lloyd. And talk about what Labor's doing, because I think actually we do have a really good story to tell. I know that might not be reflected necessarily in the day-to-day, weekly struggles that you face with managing budgets, and I appreciate that that's really tough, but some of the changes that we brought in, I think, have made a measurable difference to what things would otherwise have been if we hadn't brought that in. So one of the things that we did was stop landlords increasing rent apart from once every 12 months. We got rid of no-fault evictions, which the National Party actually wants to bring back, which I think is actually really terrible. You shouldn't be kicked out of your home for no reason. There's also, obviously other practical reasons. If the landlord wants to live in the house, there's exceptions for that, but just actually for no reason, I think that's a really terrible for your security and how you feel in your own home. We did bring in healthy home standards to make sure that rental properties need to have heaters and insulation and are healthier. We've had a big problem with the housing supply in New Zealand not meeting those standards, and if it's being rented out to you as a service, I think that does deserve to be fit for purpose and it deserves to be healthy. We did ban foreign buyers, and that has meant that although I acknowledged house prices are still very unaffordable, we've got now a higher percentage of first home buyers entering into the market, and we haven't seen the type of price increases in at least the last wee while, and we've seen prices come down from, I appreciate that it was from a very high point during COVID. So we have seen change. I think there's more to do. Supply is obviously a huge issue, and that's why I think the fact that we're building more houses than any government since the 1950s is a really good sign, and there are incentives provided within the law to allow and incentivise people to build more houses. This is something that we can't turn around overnight. In 3 years and 6 years, it's something that we have to keep investing in. And I think a point that was raised a wee bit earlier was about infrastructure being expensive, I think, by you, Nina. Infrastructure is expensive, but we need to commit to making sure that we don't fall behind on our infrastructure investments, and that includes in housing. We have to continue to build houses, we have to continue to maintain infrastructure that we have. It's not okay to just leave it for a few years or have every single government changing the way they invest in it, and that's what I'm hearing from a lot of people on that particular issue. So I think there is a lot to be really proud of in relation to housing. There's still a lot of challenges. I think one thing that won't make it better would be allowing foreign buyers to come in and essentially buy any piece of property in New Zealand as long as they pay over $2 million for it, which is what is being proposed by the National Party. I think I agree with the economists that have...
How many of them would be buying student flats, though?
Well, I think it may be that they're not buying student flats. They could be buying a building of student flats. I think that's a realistic possibility. Am I allowed more time?
Yeah. Sorry, I had a supplementary now.
They might be buying, whole buildings. That's a possibility that people could be buying. But also what we see in the housing market is huge rises at the top of the market do have impacts lower down in the market as well. There is an impact of having those higher priced property. And actually in Auckland, $2 million is a lot of money, and I'm not saying that it's not, but in Auckland there are a significant number of properties over that, and a lot of those properties will be student flats actually. I was door knocking in Ponsonby today. A lot of them were student flats. A lot of them would be over $2 million. And so I think it could have an impact on people who are students as well.
Thank you very much, Camilla. I just want to come back to Simon because she raised a good point there. The foreign buyers tax, is that just like single dwellings, or is it can like she said, can they buy an entire complex and pay $20 million for it?
Well, it's for a house that's over $2 million. So, if it's got, how many rooms or whatever, then that's it. But, it's going to be a single house. So, it's a bit of a single house. Yeah, it's for a home. Look, I think this is a distraction. The reality is it's a distraction tactic by Labor, who've been in government for 6 years, who have failed because at the moment you're sitting up there saying you've got no money to pay your rent, and you've got this government over here that have been here for 6 years. What have they done to fix that problem? And that's you still haven't got an answer.
Yeah, and I agree. That's a very good point because there was a question from me personally because I want to know, can foreigners come in and buy up a massive big student housing complex, for example?
I think that something is important to...
I was talking to Simon, yeah. Unless it's your policy as well. Do you believe in the foreign buyers tax?
We think that definitely there should be a path for foreign buyers eventually, yeah.
Okay, can you pass the mic back to Simon? I just want to get our whole buildings, can they buy up a whole student complex?
The policy is
with like 100 rooms in it?
The policy is a home, so I'm not able to clarify any further than that at the moment.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. You pass it down to Felix. Felix, I'd like let's talk about your policy, the ACT Party's policy.
I wanted to jump on that for a second, but sure.
Yeah, you jump on that for a second, and then,
sure. I'll jump on this for a second.
Let me know how the ACT Party
actually just give me the question, and I'll integrate it in and just go on it.
Say again?
Just give me the question, actually.
How will the ACT Party bring down the cost of rent for students, and what are you doing to make housing more affordable for New Zealanders?
Yeah, exactly. So the fundamental issue with housing is always the supply problem, right? Because if we don't have enough supply, then rent will continue to go up. The Labour Party can give you a little bit more in student allowance every week, or can raise the minimum wage, but the problem is that the landlord is just going to do the most sensible thing, right? They're just going to raise the rent by however much more you're given in student allowance. So the fundamental problem is, how do we actually increase supply so that we get to a point where we have a competitive housing market where people can actually get rents they can afford? And the way you do that is by getting more houses. And I think it's really telling that, Camilla was asked about the housing market, how do we make it affordable? She's had 5 years in government. Her party's had 5 years in government. They haven't done anything. Housing is still unaffordable. I remember in 2017 when I was a student listening to political debates just like you guys, the Labour Party come and say it's a disgrace that housing is like this, going on and on, we're going to build 100,000 homes. Yet 5 years later, we're still talking about it. And that's one of the biggest failures of the Labour Party in government. They haven't really addressed housing. The way you address housing is build more houses. Now, there's 3 ways to do that. The first way is you've got to fund the infrastructure. Now, you can zone all of Auckland for 3 stories, but if the pipes aren't in the ground, if the electricity isn't ready, if the councils haven't built the infrastructure so we can have 3 stories, then it doesn't really matter. The zoning doesn't really matter. Zach says, again, we need to share more revenue with local council in order to build the infrastructure so that we can get more house building done. But also, we need to simplify the regulations around house building. We need to make sure there's an emphasis on development and private property rights to create more pathways to build more houses under a new urban Development Act. If we can do those 2 things, then we can build houses in this country quickly, we can hopefully get your rents down, and we can hopefully get a better outcome.
Thank you, Felix. Do you think rents should come down? Should rents come down?
I think looking at rent, should rents come down, it's like asking, sorry, I'm going to think about how I address this question, because I think Lloyd's got a really good point here, and I want to address it in the appropriate way. People should pay the value of their rental property, right? If 2 people come together and they say, and one person saying, I'm willing to rent that property, and one person says, I'm willing to provide that property, then that rent is valid. The better question you have to ask is, how do we create a situation where more landlords are willing to accept a lower rent? And the way you do that is by increasing supply. If you think about renting through justice, you lose sight of what the real problem is. And the real problem is an economic problem to do with supply. How do we get more rentals built? I noticed at the Green Party, they talk a big game, and one of their policies is to cap increasing rents, right? To have a rent cap. Sounds all well and good, but what happens? Well, rentals become less profitable. Renting to people becomes less profitable, and what do people do? Well, we're going to build less houses, because if a developer downstream is looking at selling their property to a landlord, and if the landlord can't make as much money, then the developer is going to be less likely to build the house, because they're not going to make as much profit. So if we want to actually have a system that builds houses, we need a viable private market that actually builds houses, which is competitive and works.
Thank you very much, Felix. That's a good point. We'll come to... have we come to you, Chloe? I feel like we've come to you far too often. You haven't addressed this one, though. Yeah. So I'd like you to address some of those issues there, because it's true. If you do put a cap on renting, and with interest rates going up, and then we can't put rents up to cover those rising interest rates and the rising mortgage, what's the point in even renting them out? You can't cover your costs. So I want you to address that. And also, you did an inquiry into student accommodation 3 years ago.
We did.
The outcome of that as well. Mm-hmm. You've got 3.5 minutes to do this, so you're going to have to speak very quickly to outline the Green Party.
It's a problem, according to some people. Okay, let me just turn myself. Okay, so let's start with the fundamentals. We currently have a tax system that incentivizes people to plough all of their money into the property market. So if we want to talk about actually some of the introductory remarks that were made by Felix on behalf of the ACT Party, we were talking about Australia in particular. In Australia, they have higher income tax brackets, and they also have this thing, nifty, called a CGT. Turns out Aotearoa New Zealand is one of the only countries in the OECD that does not have any form of wealth tax, inheritance tax, stamp duty, or capital gains tax. And hey presto, we pay the price for it, and not only the fact that our house prices are overinflated because that's where all of the capital flows per the Rational Man in Economics 101, but also because we are not investing that capital that would otherwise go into productive small business, innovation, research and development. So we have to fundamentally address that issue in the tax system. Because if you're hearing these kind of propositions around how more supply solely is the solution, it's simply not the case. If that supply is only going to be swallowed up by a game of hungry hippos, whereby those who have the capital to continue to buy up those properties and then speculate on those properties with the tax treatment that is currently in place, we'll continue to see that house price inflation occur and market rent set, as Felix himself just demonstrably outlined explicitly for all of you, at the whim of the landlords, who will always extract the maximum that they possibly can.
Missing the point.
So to make it really clear, if I may, with 3 minutes, mate, if I can, to make it really, really clear, we actually already have forms of rent controls under the Residential Tenancies Act at present. They are, as Camilla just outlined, for example, rental increases of no more than once per annum, but also that rents cannot be set at more than what is called the market rate. The problem is that, as Felix alluded to, the market rate is determined by, guess what? landlords. And that becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy. So we need to introduce some form of rationality into this, and this is exactly what the Green Party has proposed, with rental increases of no more than 3% per annum. Rent controls have worked really effectively in a number of jurisdictions, particularly European jurisdictions. If you were to look at the purpose of those rent controls to be to control rents. Now you can look at what a number of economists, internationally, particularly market-based economists, have pointed out, which is that you have distortions outside of areas where rents have been capped. And you do. That is not a case against rent controls, but a case for expanding rent controls so that they are universal and that rational increase in rental prices applies across the board. The other points that I wanted to make just quickly to Camilla's point around healthy home standards, really important. We know, based on Ministry of Health's program called the Healthy Homes Initiative, that there are thousands of people presenting in our hospitals because our housing is fundamentally unfit for purpose. But we also know, based on the Healthy Home Standards written questions that I put to the Minister of Housing, that the government currently has no idea how many private landlords are complying with the Healthy Home Standards in the rental market. They also have no idea how many third-party providers have cropped themselves up capable of ostensibly verifying the Healthy Home Standards. And they also have no idea how many landlords and property managers have self-verified their exclusion from the Healthy Home Standards. So this is the point of a rental warrant of fitness, to get that certification at the get-go. It would work incredibly efficiently with a register for property managers and landlords. Because guess what? Along with our tax system, we have terrible lack of data to produce evidence-based policy in the space of rents, because we have no idea how many landlords there are in this country, nor the distribution of ownership. And again, these registers exist in other jurisdictions, and they help to produce far, far better public policy. So that's just a baseline. Rent controls, a register, and a warrant of fitness.
Thank you.
I just want to touch on 2 points, and if I have to defend investment properties and landlords, I will, because I do actually think there's a case there. So when it comes to rent controls, as I said before, there's a reason that the Labour Party opposes them, there's a reason that the National Party opposes them, there's a reason that the ACT Party opposes them, and that's because rent controls have a really negative effect on the supply of housing. Because again, if you're a commercial property developer or a residential property developer, and you're looking to build property, buy land, and then sell it to someone else, if you know that that person is going to have to rent that property as a rent controlled property, you have to sell that property for low, which means you have a narrower profit margin, which means that ultimately you don't have as much capital and as much money to invest and build that property. And so fundamentally what you get from rent controls is you get a negative downstream effect where you get less houses being built in this country. Really insidious, really bad policy. There's a reason why countries around the world have dropped this as a policy. When it comes to investment properties, I think that the conversation is really difficult to have, and it's easy to sort of sit here as students and say, it's ridiculous that properties are investments, we can't have that. I think the problem is that thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Kiwis in the 80s, in the 90s bought properties. The value of those properties went up, and now they rely on those properties as a nest egg for their retirement. They eat into them in order to save for retirement, and they rely on them as financial support for their kids and for their futures. Now, it's all well and good to say, they shouldn't be used as investment properties and the value of property needs to drop. But if the value of property drops, then a lot of those people's futures are at risk. What more, if the value of those properties drops, then you get a corresponding drop in consumption by those people who own those properties because their on-paper value has dropped, right? So it's got a really insidious effect on the economy. Because New Zealand is so over-leveraged into housing, it's very dangerous to drop the price of property. That's just a fundamental fact. It's a fundamental reality. Really dangerous policy from top and from Greens.
All right. Well,
yes, I'm talking about the way the situation is now.
We've heard from you enough. I'm sure we're going to continue to big questions, but we haven't heard from top about your housing policies.
Yeah, great.
So let's hear from a party that's not in the Parliament, that's been observing things from afar. What are your policies to solve this, because the current crop haven't been able to do it?
So firstly, I want to give everyone a bit of a history lesson about, the 90s and around the time when ACT Party came around and neoliberalism infected our government and our governmental policies. So the early 90s is when we actually started selling off a lot of our public housing and we privatised a lot of our social housing. We actually had more public housing in 1991 than we had in 2021. So if you're going to ask, why do we have sky-high housing prices today, you have to look at what we did in the 1990s. 1990s, which is why I urge you, all of you, to vote in this election, because the things that we vote for now will have effects on us in decades to come. So the people that came before us voted these policies in the 1990s, and they are affecting us now. So what we want to do with the Opportunities Party is something that hasn't been ruled out by Labour government and has been maybe toyed about with national government. We're talking about, the only policy that is actually going to stimulate more housing development, more housing supply, and bring house prices either down or stabilise so that our incomes can catch up. So this has been done in other countries and other cities and has been effective at increasing supply, and it's called a land value tax. So we would just put this on urban residential land, and what land value tax does, and it is only on the value of the land itself and not on improvements, not on the actual buildings itself. What it does is it incentivises people to actually develop that land. So instead of developing just your quarter acre section in Mount Eden or Remuera, we're saying people are going to actually be incentivised to build more intensely and increase supply. And it's going to incentivise people, instead of holding land and holding empty houses, or making them, or just holding empty houses, to actually house people or develop that land so more people will actually have housing. That's what a land value tax will do, and the land value tax will actually be used to pay for an income tax-free threshold and shifting of the tax bracket. So we actually get to keep more of our money if we are low and middle income. So how many of you guys, put your hands up if you don't qualify for student allowance? Yeah, so a lot of people here don't qualify for a student allowance. And, and I'm sure that a lot of you guys here, whether you've got student allowance or not, you're going to be working part-time. And so, why are we taxing you guys? We should not be taxing people from the very first dollar they earn. So to address this housing problem, we need to increase supply, and we need to increase the incomes for people who are low and middle income, because you students are doing it really, really hard. So the main thing we want to do is a land value tax, which will stimulate increased supply. But we also want to address this shortfall of our social housing. So we want to put a $3 billion fund into community housing projects. So community housing providers have done a really, really good job at building houses that are appropriate for their community, and they provide that wraparound support. And that's how we're going to get out of this housing crisis and actually build in places where people want to live, and houses that people want to live in. So check out the Opportunities Party, because we actually have the land value tax that actually will help increase housing supply.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Sue. How many of our candidates here, any of you guys landlords? You're a landlord? So just the Labor candidate's a landlord?
Oh, outrageous. Capitalist.
Yes, so
providing housing, Simon.
The reason
as a landlord, how hard is it as a landlord? Does it?
So my property that I rent out is in the UK. So I used to live in the UK for 7 years. And before I had my first baby in the UK, I bought a leasehold property, which is a masonette. It's 2 bedrooms. And when we left the UK, we couldn't sell it without getting a £30,000 penalty on our mortgage. So we kept it, and then Brexit happened about the time that our mortgage was due to be renewed. So it's not an intentional investment. It's just a property that was our family home that we haven't been able to sell yet. But yes, we try and be good landlords. We did do a rent reduction during COVID for our tenant there, and that's my landlord story. I actually was a landlord one other time in Wellington when we owned our family home in Wellington, and then we moved to Auckland, and then we rented. So we owned a home and I think this happens actually more than you would think. You do own a property, but you rent where you live. So we rented in Ponsonby, and we owned in Wellington, and we ended up selling our property there to our tenants.
Okay, that was not what I was expecting. Not selling because you didn't want to be taxed in the UK.
It wasn't tax. It was out to our mortgage lender. So we would have had to, the mortgage lender, if you break your mortgage early, imposes a penalty on your mortgage. So it wouldn't have gone to the government. It would have gone to to the people that we had our mortgage with. So it wasn't a tax.
Okay, I've still got lots of questions, but let's not delve into them now. Let's open it up to questions from the audience now. We've got it. Sorry? We haven't gone to this side, so there's a gentleman up the back here. Yep, in the sort of light blue hoodie. If we could get a microphone over there, that'd be great. And just make sure you make it clear who you're addressing the question to. If you want it to be to all the candidates, then it's going to make my job harder because I'll impose a 30-second time cap.
Cool. This one's for Nina. My hall of residence at Auckland Uni is increasing its rent to over $500 a week next year. Given that many students elect to live in high-density accommodation like halls or apartment complexes in central Auckland just because they're so close to uni, how will you prevent students from being ripped off by their landlords in this specific situation so that it's still financially viable for us to continue studying?
Thanks for that question. I think it would be really important to look at the ownership model of those, student accommodation and whether that's a for-profit or non-for-profit. I don't know how much ability we'd have to control that, but I think at the core of it, we do need to increase supply, but we need to do that in a way that's sustainable as well. I think it would be interesting to, do a review into those student accommodations because they should be on a model that is not for-profit. But it sounds like if they're increasing it to $500 a week, it would be really interesting to see where that $500 a week is actually going.
Who's got another question?
I know we did an inquiry into student accommodation.
Yeah, I know you're bursting at the seams, but that question wasn't directed at you.
Look at the inquiry into student accommodation, and particularly the Green Party dissenting view, because we have the solutions.
I know. You can choose. Can you see anyone? You just go for it.
I was really curious. Chloe said something about a warrant of fitness type of thing, and I think a lot of us struggle with our homes being really unfit. Like I know a friend of mine, the toilet has been broken all year. Yep. We have stairs that are like basically a ladder and we've fallen down many times. And our house actually passed a healthy home standard. I don't know how. There's so much wrong with it, and they don't get checked up on nearly enough, in my opinion. And I think it's.
Hang on, it passed the healthy home standard.
It did.
With a letter that could kill you.
Yeah, no, it's horrible.
No, but the problem is also that the people who hold themselves out, the companies that have been started to ostensibly certify the healthy home standards are not verified themselves by the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment, who are responsible apparently for the implementation of the healthy home standards. So literally it's people ticking boxes and filing their papers. There is no independent verifier for it unless you were to complain to the Tenancy Tribunal, which again places the burden on you.
And that takes so much time and effort, and it's basically impossible. So yeah, are there like some other policies from the other parties to address that, or not?
Do you believe in the healthy homes standard?
I think the problem the issue that is being raised here amplifies the fact that again there is not enough supply of houses in the market, and therefore you're having to deal with a scenario where
respectful, please, everyone.
Yeah, the lack of supply means there's less options, and if there are more options, then you could move somewhere else that was a better quality home for a different price. But you don't have that choice because there aren't enough choices in the market.
But
we need more supply, and that would assist the problem.
So you'll keep the healthy homes standard?
Look, I think having a minimum standard in regards to the quality of the home is reasonable, but the challenge underlying this is we need more supply.
Felix, I want your point on this because you guys don't like over-regulation. Is this a failure of regulation?
Yeah, I mean, it's another failure of good intention regulation that hasn't got the outcome that they wanted. At the end of the day, people accept, unfortunately, homes which are below standard, which are run down, which are mouldy, because they have no other option. I'm a student, I rent, I don't own a home, and I pay a lot of rent for what is a pretty badly built home. And I was willing to accept that home because there weren't many other options. And so when you don't have other options, you as a student are in a situation where you have to accept that. Now you could do as Chloe or TOP or as Labour suggest, and that is regulate the wazoo out of all the rentals, but all you get is less supply in the end. Because when you put more onerous obligations on landlords, then it's less profitable, they're less willing to rent, and you get a reduction in supply. If you want to increase the quality of rentals, you have to get to a situation where you have a choice between rentals. And when you have a choice between rentals, that's only satisfied if you've got supply. So at the end of the day, it's a supply issue.
But they shouldn't be able to rent them out, even if it's. Of course, we'll go for the shitty homes if they're super cheap.
But this is
We
my.
need to, but they shouldn't be able to rent it out the same way we have a minimum wage. It should not.
Yeah, and this is.
To be rented out.
Honestly, I do think you have a genuine point there, but this is like what you've brought up identifies like a very deep philosophical difference between like the right and the left here, and I'm not joking. And the point is, you know.
Is that all right?
If you look at housing and if you look at rentals through the lens of justice and say, what do I deserve? What should rentals be? What do I deserve as a person? You're always going to come to the conclusion that you deserve a better rental. But that's not the question you should ask. The question you should ask is, how do you create a situation where people are willing to come together and where a landlord is willing to build and provide a better rental? And the only way you get to that situation is if you create an economy which is productive, where it's easy to provide you those things at an affordable price. And at that point, you get the outcome you want. But if you spend every day looking at the problem saying, you know, we need this is justice, you know, I deserve to live in a warm home. It's like, well, how do you get there? That's the better question. And that's why I think ACT has a really good policy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Felix. We'll come to you, and we'll come to you, Chloe. Thank you. Thank you, Felix. He's a politician in the making. He didn't answer the question, then re-asked a question, then answered. There's a question that No, I was impressed. It wasn't a jab. I was impressed.
Can I make a quick comment?
Yeah, because a few of those barbs went to you.
Yeah.
Regulating the crap out of it, I think, is what Felix said, isn't working. And if you've got healthy homes, it's in place at the moment. There's still a pretty unhealthy home that passed the test. Do you need to beef it up or do away with it?
Well, I think there's probably two things on that. So the first thing is the healthy home standards are not health and safety checks on homes. They're about making sure that they've got adequate heating and insulation primarily. The other things that you were describing don't sound to me to be particularly compliant. If things are broken, you technically, I'll come to the enforcement, which I think is which is the point I really want to make. A lot of the time when you have a rental property and things are broken, that isn't actually allowed, and there are certain things in legislation as well that people have to provide. For example, and you probably know this already, but you know, hot water and that kind of thing. And there are provisions that for certain things that are broken, I think also a oven, I think, possibly, if that's not working. So there are certain things that you'd be justified in withholding rent, but I just double check all of those provisions because I'm just remembering them off the top of my head, but there are fundamental things that the landlord has to provide. The problem that you've identified is really the enforcement of those things. I acknowledge that can be really hard, and that's a problem with a lot of civil jurisdiction claims, is that often it relies on people actually raising the complaint and looking to get that enforced, and that can be quite hard. We do obviously have the tenancy tribunal. I think in your situation it'd be worth looking into that. I'm not saying that that's a perfect situation, and maybe we need to look at enforcement and how we can better look at the current standards that we have and making sure that people have easily accessible ways of enforcing those particular requirements that actually do already exist. And also we've got, I don't know what would happen if you took a small claims tenancy issue. I would have to look into that. But there are different ways of making that type of complaint more accessible, and so I'd personally be interested in looking into that a bit more and seeing, if there was a way of improving the current situation. What's your member's bill?
My member's bill is to do exactly
There you go.
that. Rent to warrant fitness.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our resident Labour landlord for a good understanding of the rules around rentals. We'll come to Chloe last, but
I just want to
you'd like to address
another
the
comment,
question?
please. This is just in general about the housing supply again, because we've talked about supply a lot. Those people have talked about supply. I've talked about supply, but I think when it comes down to it, is that we actually do have quite a lot of housing supply out there, but our incentives are wrong. So there are a lot of people out there who have empty homes because there is no incentive for them to actually house people. It's okay that they're saying, we over-regulate the housing market so people don't want to rent the homes. I think that's probably like a valid argument for some people to not rent out their homes. So what we need to do is actually put incentives on these homeowners to actually house people, because we have enough housing to house people in New Zealand, but we just don't have the willpower or the incentives to do so. And a land value tax will do that, because people can't get away without paying this tax, and things like a capital gains tax will not incentivize people to actually house people. And when we talk about supply, we have the supply there, but people are just not incentivized to do so with the current tax settings.
I think the founder of the Top Party had a gazillion houses, didn't he? He had a property empire, and he just said it was just easy to keep them empty. So I didn't have to replace the carpets.
Exactly.
And that's a failure of the system.
Yep.
But also, he still owned all of those homes. Interesting. Chloe, what's your...
He was also a proponent of universal basic income, so...
You're about to burst at the seams, Chloe, about this. Maybe keep it a bit more concise.
Concise?
Than usual.
I have a members' bill on precisely this, which would look at taking the healthy home standards that we currently have, as well as consolidating a number of other pieces of legislation like the building code, health and safety, and also actually the fire and emergency standards. This really came to the fore throughout the Loafers Lodge fire. Currently, we don't have those checks, and if we were able to consolidate all of them, put them in one place so that people knew what they were entitled to, and implement that through a certification scheme through the Warrant of Fitness, where we would verify the verifiers, then we would also have that centralised repository of the quality of housing in this country, which would work in tandem with the register for property managers and landlords, so that we could ensure that those apparent one-off bad apples weren't able to continue repeat offending. Because right now there are no standards if you are entering the market as a landlord other than having the capital necessary to purchase a property. There are no qualifications. There is nothing that is a barrier to entry. So the register would also act as kind of an opportunity to educate people of both their rights and responsibilities and engaging in this space. And I've written about this extensively if you want to Google it as well. But I also just wanted to really briefly point to student accommodation, because actually what we're talking about here in the Residential Tenancies Act is under Section 5B of the RTA, student accommodation is excluded. You do not have in student accommodation any of the rights that a person in residential tenancy has. So even those things that I was talking about with regard to market rate caps do not apply to you. We did the student accommodation inquiry spearheaded by me after I heard from a number of students across the country, particularly most egregious from Vic Uni, in 2020, and finalised that report at the start of this term of Parliament. I'd been pushing for student accommodation to come into the RTA, because that would mean that you would have access to the likes of the Tenancy Tribunal and otherwise. We didn't manage to get there. The Greens dissenting view obviously is there for sake of the record. But what we did manage to do is set up the first ever compensation scheme that exists for students through NZQA of all places. So if you do have issues with student accommodation and you're having issues with how you go about accessing that compensation, you can email me and I can help you go through that process. The other thing that we got through that inquiry was the first ever Pastoral Care Code of Conduct, because prior to that there was no standards of responsibility that any of the universities or polytechs around this country had when it came to providing you with pastoral care standards.
Thank you very much. Felt like the speaker then. I'm on my feet.
Yeah, that was just track record. That's stuff we've actually done.
Thank you very much. Have we got any more questions? There was a guy up the back with a checkered shirt on. Yep. You've got the mic, yeah? Do you want to pass? Sorry, I will come to you next. Apologies. I've got really terrible peripheral vision.
Hi.
Fire away. Maybe make it to one candidate, because that just dragged on.
It is, I promise.
Yeah.
So this one's actually to the National Party. I have an article on my phone on the New Zealand Herald from April where the housing spokesperson says that they will reintroduce no-cause evictions if National are in government. My question is, how would National protect renters if this came into force? For example, what's going to stop my landlord if I say to her, hey, I'm sick of cultivating mushrooms in my shower, from kicking me out and forcing me to leave, when there are other more desperate people who could take a poor home? This has nothing to do, in my opinion, with supply. How would National make sure that renters are protected and not unfairly treated like they have been in the past?
Yeah, not a problem. I mean, I'm glad you're cultivating mushrooms in your shower and not other things, but that's fair enough for you. The purpose of our legislation is for those renters that are blatantly being a problem and basically abusing the situation of the arrangement in which they've got in place, and the inability for the landlord to be able to have any power to evict them out of that home environment because of that behaviour. And I don't think that's unreasonable. If you're not going to, there's rights and responsibilities, and if you don't comply with your responsibilities, I don't think it's reasonable as a landlord that you don't have the ability to apply some consequences if you're not following those rules. And so that's the purpose and the intent around that legislation. I think the aspect that you're referring to around in a genuine situation is there needs to be a threshold around what is reasonable. And, growing mushrooms in your shower, I mean, if that's your hobby, that's great. But I'd find that challenging to see whether that would meet a threshold of which would be a basis for you to be evicted from your flat. So I think, the purpose is there around the end of town, which is where people are really being, not doing what they're meant to do, and finding and levelling up that relationship so that there's a reasonableness around that. And outside of that, I think you should be okay.
I just think on that sort of 2 points, like one, there already exists provisions in our current legislation, like for antisocial tenants and people who don't pay their rent. And I think it would be pretty reasonable for pretty much anyone to have like law that would say, hey, if you're like trashing the house, this is not good enough. But my concern is that like people and property managers are like not listening to their tenants when they complain about like mold and mildew and mushrooms in their shower. And I'm just concerned that like would National actually like legislate a provision that stops this, because the whole idea of it is like there is no cause. So if there's no cause, there's like no standards or no requirements for this to occur.
It's almost like the 90-day trial.
Do you want to cover that?
There you go. I'll give you more riders.
It's great when you're in government, you've got all the power, but you can blame everyone else for it. The reality is that, in that situation, I'm still thinking in terms of the case where, what is reasonable and what is not. And, the thresholds that you're talking about, the majority of landlord and tenant relationships are positive, right? We're talking about the 1 or 2% at a national level where there are issues. And the challenge is particularly when most of those landlords are mum and dad investors that may have one rental home, in the main, and I've been a student, I've had those type of flatting arrangements, we had pretty good things. Were there issues? Yes. Did we sometimes get a bit frustrated with it? Yes, but there was never anything too major. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but in the main, our view is a majority relationship is pretty good. We've got and agree with around some of those minimum standards. There are mechanisms, as we talked around before, around taking action where landlords are blatantly not providing the services that they need to do. And the question there is that system working appropriately to achieve the outcome? And the point around enforcement and the right pressures around those landlords that are blatantly not doing what they should do and not meeting their obligations, the law should come down on them, right? We would support that.
I have a question for Simon. When you were a student in a student flat, what year was it?
Well, I've been to university twice, but the second time I was an adult student. So I would have been 1999.
How much did you pay in rent per week?
I can't remember.
Was it more or less than $100?
It wasn't. To the point around the lady before who said 70%, it was definitely not of that ratio. And I'm an accountant as well, so I would remember how much the proportions were, but it was definitely not that proportion.
Why do you think that is?
You've made your point. You're going to hand and then I think we've got a question down the front. Our right, your left.
Not a good job.
Okay,
so I actually tried to ask this question in the last section, but I think I was missed again. But this is about the environmental climate change things we talked about. Given all the talk around using biotech to counteract climate change and also increase agricultural efficiency, what are your positions on opening up the gene editing laws to actually allow us to do this?
Okay, well, is there any parties here that is planning to do that?
Great question. Absolutely, we need to open up those laws. It's something we need to look into. 100% support.
Great. Well, let's just move along because.
Yeah, let's move along.
Yep, I like that. Keep it brief. It's good.
Yeah. As we said, we've got a policy around that, and we have a regulator to put in place to make sure we've got the right controls and balances around that area.
I think the science is changing around genetic engineering. There's different types of genetic engineering, some which is, direct gene editing in terms of base sequences, cutting and pasting genetics from other organisms into other organisms. But what we look at is what's happening in Australia, and it's talking about how can we do genetic engineering that's safe. There's some genetic engineering which is just simply turning on and off genes, which is actually something that happens. It's called epigenetics, and it happens normally as well. So I think that there is a place to actually look at what is in our Act at the moment and modify it slightly to go with the science, which is actually, it is safe to turn on and off genes, but it remains to be seen whether it's safe in terms of doing actual modifying of the genetic base sequence.
So there is currently a review underway, but it's primarily looking at the health system. Something to note is that the last time that we had a meaningful inquiry into this in this country was like 20 odd years ago, the Royal Commission, and again, as many have mentioned, the science has moved on. So I do think that there is really valid call for concern for us to look into this deeper, but I think that it is a lot more complicated than it is sometimes made out. Some things to unpack in this are the likes of intellectual property and particularly potential supply of the control of the food chain, for example. So, the concerns around, for example, Monsanto and the need to continually buy the same crops, and then how that ends up kind of, aggregating kind of control of the supply chain with one major corporate. That's of concern. There are also quite substantive Te Tiriti ramifications here if you're looking at releasing out into the country and the kind of, again, needing to pull together mana whenua across Aotearoa, because again, if you're releasing gene-edited rats, for example, because you're looking to kind of control pests, then those rats are potentially going to be crossing boundaries, etc. And I think the other thing to take into account is that I have heard frequently over the last 7 years that I've been involved in politics, the spectre of GE consistently raised as though it's going to solve all of these crises, when actually, in a lot of instances, the science actually just doesn't exist. We have the opportunity to invest in and to look into the science, but oftentimes I see it as an opportunity for politicians to kick the can down the road on certain climate actions.
I'm talking about research that's happening right now at this university, that crops that are being made that are much more efficient in terms of water usage, that are safe, that have been tested, but that are not allowed to be used in New Zealand to counteract climate change because of the strict regulations that we have. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, totally. And to that effect, I'd say with all of that stuff, that's why we need a far broader inquiry into looking at that. But I also say there's a need to really consider Te Tiriti ramifications there, because there is substantive kind of considerations with the framework of our constitution. But broader than that, and to that point, while there are absolutely things that we can do with climate action with the technology that does exist, I frequently hear it as the catch cry for the solving of all of these issues, which is the kicking the can down the road that I was alluding to.
Lloyd, this is the hypocrisy of the Green Party.
Here we go.
This is the absolute hypocrisy of the Green Party, because we've got technology in this country that could potentially solve one of our biggest problems, which is a reduction of methane for livestock and agriculture. Yet the Greens have, over the past number of years, blatantly pushed back in allowing that technology to be able to be used in this country. And the National Party have got a policy to allow that to be done in this country, because that is what will solve our climate challenges in agriculture.
Vaccine,
so I think it's quite interesting.
How developed is the methane vaccine? No, you're talking about the methane vaccine. You're talking about that as the solution to the climate crisis and our agricultural emissions. How far developed is that?
Sorry?
You were talking about methane emissions. You were talking about methane emissions. You are the climate spokesperson for the National Party, and you're talking about methane emissions. You were talking about genetic engineering as the solution to them. How far developed is the methane vaccine?
Well, I don't know the answer around how far away.
Here we go!
No. But what's your point? The point that's being raised is that we're doing technology here at this university that could solve some of the biggest problems that we face globally. And why can we not roll that technology out in this country? Why does that technology have to go to Australia or the US to be tested? Because our regulations are not up to date. That is unacceptable. We need to modernise and we need to allow the stuff to occur in here, and we should be part of creating that solution, not proposing and pushing against it.
My point is, Simon, that you are extrapolating to the point of abstraction, because what you were banking on is technology that currently... No. This is the core point, mate. Shush. The core point that I am making is that you are speaking about methane, you are speaking about half of our climate-changing emissions, and you are speaking about a technology that is currently not ready for market. So you are speaking nonsense as far as that goes. When we're talking about other types of gene-edited technologies, absolutely, there is a place for them, but they are not going to solve the climate crisis, which was my core point. My core point is that you are banking on something which effectively sees you kicking the can down the road on other interventions that we know are going to work, such as, for example, this amazing technology. It's existed for millennia. It's called a tree. The National Party, when they were last in government, decided to amend the RMA, which got rid of urban tree protection, which saw a decimation of our tree canopy here in Taamaki Makaurau. Okay. We worked for 15 years to reinstate it, and we just did it.
I think this is just a really unfair characterisation. the issue is not, is the technology ready now? And we're not saying it's going to be the whole solution. No one here believes that genetic engineering is the whole solution. All we're saying is that the technology is being developed. There's potential there, and we need to bring it into New Zealand, and your party has been the main opposition to advancing this technology in New Zealand and introducing it. That's just all we're saying. So you don't need to blow it up.
I've just said to you that we need to look into this properly and adequately with a fulsome Royal Commission. No, we cannot pretend that we can just let this stuff out into nature when we have a totally different constitutional arrangement and consideration of Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Your party's record was to oppose it years ago, and only now you've moved to a position where you're considering it under review. We're saying that we need to move to a position where we accept this technology, right? Your party's position for years has been to rail against farmers, to say we need to add agriculture to the ETS, while with the same hand taking away technology and say, oh, we can't have that. That could actually make the position better for our farmers.
I would encourage you to talk to federated farmers who hold substantial concerns about
I would encourage you to do that as well. I would encourage you to do that as well.
I literally met with them before Parliament rose about precisely this issue, and there are concerns about how genetically modified organisms could have impacts with regard to our trading relationships and our export markets. So again, this is a little bit more complicated, and the point of having experts around the table to produce a fit-for-purpose piece of regulation that would work here for our context in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
I think I'm just going to draw a line under that. That was fun, though. I quite enjoyed that. Very quick question for you, though, Chloe. Are the Greens against GE? Because that's kind of how you started. Are you still against it?
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I'll give you a very free and frank point, which is that there are very strong and very differing views in our party, and that the position that we have is that there is a serious need to look at this from the position of bringing the experts around the table with serious consideration of all of those component parts that I've just spoken about.
So it's under review. Wonderful. Thank you for that question. We're going supplementary.
Complicated has been an excuse to not have this discussion for many, many years, and it has inhibited a lot of progress in the sector.
And to that I would say that me saying it's complicated now is not me saying that we shouldn't have the review and bring the experts around the table and trigger that occurring. I'm not saying that is not an excuse to us doing that review so that we can then put in place fit-for-purpose regulations.
All right, for time we're doing actually okay. We've probably got another. Have any questions come through on the QR code?
Yes, we've got quite a few.
Oh, heck. Have we got any nice ones to finish off? Or should we just open up to the audience? What would you? Yeah, okay. Who wants the lucky last question? That's probably. No. Sorry? No, I'm not going to pick. We're sort of already. Yes, but you've got wearing a top jacket, and I don't. This man in the middle. Are you affiliated with any parties, or are you a member of Labour, Nats, Greens, any of them? Okay, someone may have mistakenly or intentionally signed you up.
Cool. So my question is for Simon from National. So I think it's really cool that we've been talking about like the barriers to accessing education in the form of student accommodation. But I think that another really key barrier to accessing education in the first place is just the tuition fees. And one of the major reasons why I was able to come to uni this year was because I was eligible for free fees. But since it became a thing, I think around in 2018, I saw lots of things about National either repealing fees free or replacing it with something else. And so my question is, how successful do you think fees free has been since it was implemented? And what do you think its future would be if National comes into government?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the conversation that we had about a year ago with students was talking about the dropout rate. And basically the students were outlining, these were nursing students, that basically a third dropped out in the first year, a third dropped out in the second year, and only a third made it through to the third year. And I guess that sort of came into the conversation more broadly around the cost to be a student and the implications around that and family and running a job and all of that. National are supportive around fees free, just in terms of the policy position. It's not our intent to take it away. But I think the broader challenge is how do you deal with that dropout rate and what are the underlying issues that are causing that. And I don't think there's necessarily one aspect that's at play, but there are multiple things. We've heard stuff around the cost of rent, which is a big factor, but also, the consideration around, having family, right? So not everyone coming in to be a student is without a family or may have kids, different stages, part-time working. Most students are actually probably working full-time when you think about the hours required in order to meet the costs that are in front of you, in addition to that. And then you've got the pressures around just the general stress of life and all of that. So, fees free, we've got a position on that. We're not going to change that, but we do need to address some of the other underlying issues, and, that's something that we need to get our teeth into.
Great, we should do a quick fire on fees free. What's your position on fees free? Keep it, extend it, keep it as it is?
Keep it, ideally extend it. We did have a proposal to do that. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that through COVID, but that would be our preferred thing, would be to extend it, and that was our original proposal.
The Greens?
I can say so many things.
Okay.
Fees free and universal student allowance.
Okay, top.
There's only so much money to go around, so I'd rather have universal student allowance than fees free.
Cool. Okay, National's going to keep fees free as it is. Are you going to review it?
Didn't meet its KPI, going to cut it, absolutely, get rid of it.
You'd get rid of it?
Yeah, I can give into the longer justification, but I thought it was a quick fire.
Yeah, no, that is quick fire.
Yeah.
So please don't.
You can speak to me afterwards if you like.
Of it. What about making the third year or your final year fees free, so you pay for your first and your second, and as an incentive you get the third? That might solve the dropping off problem.
No, the dropping off problem is the dropping off problem is to do with day-to-day costs of living. So I have, for the past 6 years, tried to get information out of the Ministry of the Environment, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Social Development, the Tertiary Education Commission, Universities New Zealand, and so many others at Education and Workforce Select Committee about what data they're keeping on how many hours students are working, dropout rates and otherwise. Time and again, they tell me that they don't have the data and therefore there is no problem and therefore they're not going to collect the data. Tried to get an inquiry through the Education and Workforce Select Committee into precisely this, wasn't able to for many years trying, so we did our own people's inquiry into student wellbeing with 30 plus student associations across the country, and what we found is the unfortunate, albeit not surprising, reality that 2/3 of students regularly cannot afford the basics. This was verified by...
Good quick fire.
Yeah. But look, long story short, back when Grant Robertson was the head of NZUSA, he's now a Minister of Finance, he was railing against the parental means testing that exists to this day for student allowance, when only 37% of students back then were getting access to student allowance. Guess what? Now it's even fewer. So this thing is a matter of political decisions, and we can pay for it with a fairer tax system.
Thank you. Thank you for that concise answer, Chloe. That brings us to an end of the debate. Thank you very much to all of our candidates for enduring some of the hairiness and some of the heckles from the audience. Thank you very much for coming, all of you as well, and thanks for participating. Some cracker questions. I'd just like to invite Melissa, though, from the Debating Society to come up for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thank you especially to our partners of hosting the event, Ngā Arawhetu. They're a research entity at the University of Auckland, so if you have any academic ideas about what you think the solutions to climate change are, Ngā Arawhetu works really hard to find funding arrangements and scholarships for those kinds of research ventures. So if that interests you, make sure to get in contact with them, and if you liked the kind of heckling and rebuttal and interesting impacting from the different representatives on the debate tonight, make sure that you come and check us out. We do this kind of thing all of the time, and lots of the candidates here tonight have been involved in debating before. So if you have very vocal opinions, and even if you just like observing people who have those very vocal opinions, come and join the Debating Society. Just also thank you so much to all of the candidates who have come, and apologies, Te Pāti Māori was meant to send Takutai Moana Kemp tonight, but she's sick, so unfortunately she couldn't be with us. So please make sure that you do go investigate Te Pāti Māori's policies and compare to what you've heard from candidates tonight. Thank you very much, everyone, and I'll hand back to Lloyd to close off for us.
Cool. Thank you very much, Melissa. And I now pronounce this closed. Is that how you close it? Have a good night. Thank you very much.
I thought you were great, Moray, and I thought you were very impressive.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'll hold the mic down here so our conversations don't get...
Thank you. That's the picture.
Bloody good. Yeah. Well, yeah, so that's good.